Uh, Okay. So we've talked about different issues since the beginning of this program, since we started this series, and we've talked about quality, getting published, collaborating, and all of that. And today we will be talking about a topic that is very important. Some of us are already very familiar with this issue, while some of us are not familiar with it yet. And so we think that this might be an opportunity for those of us who are already familiar with it to get into this conversation, to begin to see who or the other people from across the continent who are interested in this kind of discussions as well, and how can we begin to collaborate. So we're looking at decolonizing education research in Africa, and this is a very important one, like I said. So without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and introduce the keynote speaker for today, who will be taking us in this journey. And sorry, I need to make him co-host right now. So Kenneth is our keynote speaker today, and Kenneth is someone that I've known for a while. Is someone that I've had the privilege of working with, collaborating with, and at different points in time. And it's just really amazing for us to be able to share this platform today, getting this conversation started. I think one of the first time that it's not the first time that we started engaging myself and Kenneth, but one of the times I just felt like this guy is just out of this world was when he wrote one of his essays, and I think this was on your PhD, you can tell me about it later, wrote one of his essays on decolonization, and it got about a 97 thereabout on that paper, and I just felt like, wow, this is just absolutely incredible. So I'm just going to really read a very short profile of Kenneth Jamera. I always struggle to pronounce Ghanaian names, is an educational policy analyst and researcher with 7 years of experience in national and international contexts. Kenneth is interested in international development, education, and civic engagement. He is currently pursuing a PhD in education at the Faculty of Education at Queen's University in Canada. As Chevening Scholar, Kenneth holds an MSc in Education Policy and International Development with distinction from the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom, and a Bachelor's of Education from the University of Education, Winneba, Ghana. He previously worked as a research consultant for Civicus Alliance for Citizen Participation, where he co-designed Youth Action Lab, a youth co-creation lab that is providing resources and tools to support youth activists across the global South. Kenneth has also worked as a research consultant for Plan International Sweden, where he explored the civic implications for children and for youth activists in 21 different countries, covering Latin America, Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Like I said, Kenneth is from Ghana and is just an amazing, phenomenal young man. And it's such a great honor to have you here. So over to you, Kenneth.
Thank you, Luis. And thanks, everyone. Hi. So it's morning here, 8:12 in the morning. And I am very honored to be here with all of you to share some few thoughts on decolonizing educational research in the African context. So I'm going to share my screen. Please let me know if my screen is
yes, it is up.
Okay, yeah. So before I enter this conversation, so I, just like Louis said, I'm currently in Canada pursuing my PhD in education, and decolonizing education for me is a gift for all of us who are interested in research, especially from Africa, to research back. And by researching back, I mean that we need to undo the dirty history of Eurocentric research that has been taking place in our continent for a long time. So I am interested in decolonizing educational research because I believe that research can be used for different things. Research can be used for healing, social transformation, and development. At the same time, research can be a very oppressive tool, especially when it comes to developing countries. So why do we need to decolonize education research in Africa? According to Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, who is an anthropologist from New Zealand, in her seminal work in 1999, she talked about research as a dirty word. So in this case, Linda was talking about how research has been used to colonize the Maori people of New Zealand, who are part of the indigenous groups in New Zealand. And as a result of that, the people have a very questionable experience or like outlook when it comes to research. And she talked about how research has contributed to destroying the indigenous knowledge systems and indigenous ways of knowing, being, and seeing of the Maori people. Another scholar whose work also talked about decolonizing research, especially in the education context, is Bajao Chilisa, who is from Botswana. And one of her works in 2012, she talked about how research has been used in the African context to create the colonized other. So more like research using to separate two races, like Black people and white people.
Kenneth, sorry to cut you. Some people are struggling to hear you, so but I can hear you clearly. So if you maybe speak a bit louder, maybe that could help. And, okay. And also, guys, sorry to cut you, Kenneth. So guys, if also check your audio from your end as well, because I can hear him clearly. Also, I typed something in the group. This session is going to be a lot engaging. So please get your questions and comments ready. Over to you, back to you. Sorry, Kenneth.
Okay, so I will increase my voice here. So in this case, these two scholars have talked about how research has become a very dirty word when it comes to formerly colonized people. So Chilisa, who is from Botswana, talks about the need to decolonize research, especially in the education context. And she talks about decolonization as a process of conducting research in a way that the worldviews of those who have suffered a long history of oppression and marginalization are given space to communicate from their frames of reference. It is a process that involves researching back to question how the disciplines, that is psychology, education, history, anthropology, sociology, or the social sciences, through an ideology of othering, have described and theorized about the colonized other and refuse to let the colonized other name and know from their frame of reference. So what we can take from what Chilisa is saying is that when we talk about decolonizing research, it is a way of, bringing back the voices of African people. So in the African context, we have African ways of knowing. We have African knowledge systems that can be found or that are contained in our proverbs, in our stories, in our ceremonies, in our practices, even in our value systems. And research has been one-sided because it is always coming from the Western world. And they have, over the years, been prescribing what a good research looks like. And when it happens this way, it creates othering because it has created this idea of singularity of knowledge. Like it is assuming that modernity or civilization or knowledge production can only come from Euro-America. But we of African people and other indigenous people worldwide have indigenous knowledge systems that in a way, generate knowledges that are really, really important for the development of our world. And we frame our work, or we understand reality, we understand our world from our culture and other things around us. So how can we bring research back to Africa in a way that we will theorize from our own ways of knowing, and then based on that, engage with other bodies of knowledge? So the idea of decolonizing research is not to say Western research methodology are not good, but then they are limited. And then we have also learned that they have been used to cause distraction of African knowledge systems and like our beliefs systems. So for us to benefit from research, there is a need for us to use Africa as a cultural center when we talk about research. So why decolonize research in Africa? There is Euro-Western discourse of what constitutes varied knowledge. So, you know, when it comes to the global knowledge production, or even when we talk about generation or production of knowledge, we have all realized that knowledge is coming from the margins, or knowledge is coming from the global south, have not been given primacy. Indigenous knowledges from Africa have not been recognized as a body of knowledge that is relevant to compete in the global research landscape. And for instance, when we during the COVID time, the development of vaccines and all that, we could realize that when some of the countries in Africa, or even in the global south, like China and all these countries, said, oh, they could also come up with drugs or even vaccines, nobody believed them, because they want to put these ways of knowing into a typical laboratory where it goes through different processes. Whilst that is good, sometimes what it does is that it claims that like the only ways of knowing or valid knowledge is knowledge coming from Europe and America, which is not always the case. And also the idea of the African research agenda, which is also being spearheaded by researchers, development practitioners, and neo-colonial institutions based in the northern countries or the Western countries. We see that Westerners coming to Africa all the time, conducting helicopter research, coming, taking data, going back to their country, analyzing the data, and writing about it without recognition of the African people. And even when they are involved, they only use our people they call local experts for data collection. Recognition is not given, and most of the time, even from the colonial era, some anthropologists came to Africa, collected data, wrote about certain things that when the African hears about that, they are really, really shocked to hear that. These are some of the ways that Euro-Western research is used to harm African people and not also recognized experts who are on the continent doing fantastic work. And also the idea of epistemicide, of African ways of knowing, being, and doing. So when we talk about epistemicide, Boaventura Sus Santos, he is from Portugal. He talks about the destruction of knowledge systems. So when we are not allowed to engage in research, framing from our own ways of knowing, our own indigenous ways of doing, our own indigenous ways of understanding reality, what happens is that they end up destroying our knowledge system, including our language systems. So there's also the recognition of African indigenous knowledge systems in global knowledge production, which I've talked about, that African ways of knowing, African indigenous knowledge systems have not been recognized. And this is also having an impact on how Africans are publishing in international high impact journals. According to a research by Mitchell and his colleagues, they found that among the top high impact journals around the world, only 5% of research coming from Africa are published. And even when they are publishing African work, there is a high possibility that when the first author is African, that paper will not be accepted unless an African collaborates with like a white person or a Western person. And even when they do that, the recognition is not the same, because always the African is seen as the local expert who is only used for data collection. In this case, there has also been limited engagement of African educational philosophies in conventional research. We continue to listen to the work from Foucault and all these people who are from Europe. And it is assumed that these are the only ways of theorizing. But we also have African philosophies. We can talk about Sankofa from Ghana, going back to the past, thinking about the past to situate the issues in the present in order to move forward. We have Ubuntu. We have in Ghana, in Nigeria, in South Africa, we have our own philosophies that are really, really relevant when it comes to research. But always as Africans, we are asked to write our theoretical framework and all that, framing from Europe. How can this knowledge be beneficial when we are not using how we understand ourselves as people and the philosophies that guide us in doing research? So towards an African-centered research paradigm, you know, when we talk about research paradigm, which all of you are aware of, we can look at issues around ontology. We can also look at epistemology, axiology, and methodology. In some qualitative work or in some other research work, they talk about paradigms using only ontology, epistemology, and axiology. But from an African-centered way of seeing research, we do not see any difference between these four. We see them as more of a circular and fluid way of understanding a research paradigm. In this way, they are inseparable. So when we talk about research coming from Africa, we talk about relationships. So relational ontology. So the ontology is our reality. How do we interpret the world? How do we understand the world? We understand the world from different ways. We understand the world from engaging with communities, from engaging with both the living and the non-living. We even engage the ancestors sometimes. We also engage the cosmos. We engage the creator. We have the creation story. All these things provide us a way, a multiple worldview or perspective of seeing reality. But when it comes to the Western way of seeing the world or understanding the world, it is assumed that there's an objectivity, there's an absolute truth, and then we can only see the world from a very linear sense. So how will this ways of being be relevant for an African, or even be relevant for the way we do research, where we are only looking at objectivity? When we talk about relational epistemology, African-centered research, as African people, we learn from relationships. And then we can talk about the African indigenous knowledge systems, which are found in our stories, which are found in our proverbs, which are found in our ceremonies and all that. It is through these relationships. So we see knowledge creation not as something universal or something individualistic. We see it as a community way. We generate or we co-produce knowledge together. So in our context, we understand that knowledge doesn't belong to an individual. But then how do we look at this in Western research, which we have all been co-opted into? In the Western research, it is seen that the researcher is the knower. The researcher is a person who knows everything. And anybody who is part of that research is a respondent. You are just responding to questions. So here, the relationship is clear. For Africans, we believe that knowledge does not belong to an individual. And we also believe in the role of elders in the communities, who are sometimes referred to as the libraries of the community. They have valid knowledges that are really relevant for looking at some of the developmental challenges that we have. And then we talk about ethics, the ethics of doing research, which there's a lot of questions on that, because the ethics will frame the whole research process. And when we look at ethics from the Western context, we look at it from a way of providing a false sense of security to participants. But that is not the case in Africa. When we look at ethics, we also look at respect for protocols. You cannot enter a certain community and just do what you want to do. But these Westerners always come in do whatever they want to do and go. But our African ways of ethics is situated in our value systems. And it is our moral obligation as researchers to protect the people that we work with, and also not just to protect them. The Western ways of seeing ethics is just protection and security. But in our own ways of doing things as Africans, when we talk about ethics, we also talk about reciprocity, like recognizing the people who are part of the work that we are doing, not seeing them as just respondents, but seeing communities as knowledge holders and knowledge producers, and giving them the due recognition, reimbursing them for the knowledge that they share with us. And we talk of methodology as the ways of examining this reality that we have. And the methodology that we use in African way of knowing is different from how we can look at it from what we have been doing from the Western world. So research in the a decolonial way of doing research is conducted with and by the community. It is not conducted on communities. We have seen that Western research, we are coming to Nigeria. We want to look at education in northern part of Nigeria, but they don't even involve the stakeholders. They don't even involve the student. They are just collecting data on them. They are not conducting with and by them. Also, relationships takes precedence of all the processes in the research. When we look at decolonial way of doing, relationality is very important, because you cannot just, I as a Ghanaian, my positionality does not allow me to come to Nigeria and claim that I can conduct research there. I need to have forged relationship with the community or the people or even stakeholders who will introduce me to the research field. And when I come there, my positionality also tells me that I am a learner, I am a searcher, I am a storyteller. I am not a knower. I am not the person who knows. It is rather the community who have the stories. It is rather the community who have the data, and the data is generated by them. So they need to be recognized. And without these relationships, we cannot do any quality work, because what we do is that we assume we already know. And then the ethical framework used in decolonial research is based on the 4 R's of research, which is respect, relationships, reciprocity, and responsibility. We need to respect the participant. We need to respect the community. We need to respect their ways of knowing, their indigenous knowledges. We need to also build relationships with them. We need to reciprocate. So we don't have to see ourselves as people who know, but we see that mutual existence of co-learning. And also in doing this, recognizing them for their work in our publications, acknowledging them, because Africans have always produced knowledge for the West with no recognition. They come and take the data and go. They come and take our natural resources and go with no recognition. Now they are using research to do the same. So as an African people, are we interested in following this thing that is causing harm to our ways of knowing and even our understanding of reality and life? Also, communities in a decolonial way of doing research, the community become the agenda setter or the agenda center. So in this case, you cannot just begin and create your own research questions and so I'm going to Ghana and do this work. You need to involve the community from start to finish, from conceptualization, from your research question, from your research design, from your data collection. Even when you collect the data with them, you need to feed back the data, what they call the meaning-making process, collaborative data analysis, where you involve your co-researchers, the people that you work with, to look at the data and see whether what you are writing about them is the original thing that they said. This is how we can decolonize research and humanize it and make it very useful for community. And the researcher is just considered as a transformative healer. In a decolonial research, knowledge is co-constructed through participatory approaches. So in this case, it is not the researcher who I know I am the researcher, I am doing research, and this idea of humility, like, oh, I am generating or co-producing, like in my work, I am producing knowledge. You are not producing knowledge. You are co-constructing knowledge. The knowledge is with the people, and you are just trying to search. You are just a searcher. You are just looking into this thing. You are seeking for information, but you cannot seek information and get your findings and say you have produced knowledge. No, the knowledge is not yours. The knowledge came based on the relationship that you had. So for you to really do a research that will bring out the best from the community, you need to use participatory approaches, involving them from start to finish. And then research should be seen as a ceremony instead of seeing it as an academic way of, producing and generating data, going back and not doing anything about it again. So when we talk about decolonizing research, we need to look into the way we collect data. We need to look into the methods that we use, instead of using methodologies that will not bring out the best in participants. We need to rather work with participants, respecting the traditional protocols, their ways of knowing, their ways of being, and understanding how they look at research from that context. So I will end here because of time, and I want to say thank you all for listening to my rant.
Thank you so much, Kenneth, for that wonderful, wonderful presentation. You see, Kenneth, I really, really enjoyed listening to you, and your presentation was absolutely on point. It was apt. I was just looking at your slides, and I know that the points that you touched on are points that one can spend hours and hours talking about. Because I mean, talking about epistemicide alone, for example, and exploring the work of Boaventura de Sousa Santos can really, really take a lot of time talking about all these things. And I think what we're trying to do here today is really to get ourselves stimulated, getting ourselves, to that space of understanding. And I love how you talked about it from the area of participatory approaches, the fact that we can consider this conversation, the fact that we need to take ownership of the research process, including the ontology, the relative of ontology to the epistemology, to the methodology as well, because it's very important. And I think that's the essence of what we're doing here, to get African researchers, African education researchers to the point where we can take ownership of the work that we're doing. And we understand that research isn't just, like you said, an academic endeavor to probably get to a certain position or to get some. It's really about understanding what's going on in the community, what role can I play? And I think that's the whole essence. So like I said, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. Kenneth will keep you around because as much as possible, we want this to be very, very participatory and interactive as well. So everybody in the session now, if you have questions or contributions, please hold on to them, because I just want to try and stimulate us a little bit more in the next few minutes, and then I'm going to hand on the baton to everybody here to make your contributions, to ask questions and all of that. So I'm just going to go back to my slides and just share a little bit more. So I wanted to start by showing this just for us to have a little bit idea of, because, Kenneth, you and I have engaged with a lot of articles and resources in decolonization, and we are still learning. All of us are still learning to understand what we are doing really and how we want to approach this, but also to let more people have an idea of what we're talking about. So if we look at this map, for example, it's different from what we're familiar with in this 21st century. And this is like a map of Africa in 1880. That was pre-colonial of some sort, during that just before the whole colonization to independence and all of that. So you can see it's just a plain continent with so many people, different people, and you can see the connections are there and all of that. I won't spend too much time. I just want to walk you through these slides. It's a lot about African maps. The next one is what happened within that period. And shortly after that period, when the map was just like that, we saw this scramble for Africa, which is when the periods that Kenneth was talking about, well, basically touching on how Eurocentrism and American ideologies and stuff began to take over. And you can see from the map how different people from different countries began to drag the continent and wanting a share of the continent. And we probably understand how this then led to the colonial times, when we now have this kind of map, which is almost like a colonial map of Africa, and different people having their own share of the continent as well. Then moving on from this period, we see a time when the continent is now being distinguished or separated or segmented by language. And you see we now have the Anglophone Africa, the Francophone Africa, the Lusophone Africa. And so the separation came not just by the people that colonized, but also language of separation, okay, which of course wasn't even our indigenous languages anyway. So what we now have is this contemporary African map that is highly segmented, highly partitioned, and everybody is like the north of Africa, the west of Africa, the east of Africa, the center of Africa, the south of Africa, and so many different things, you know, and so it makes it really hard sometimes to understand who we are as Africans when we talk about we as Africa. So now looking at the reason why I had to do that is for us to have a little more idea on what the colonization has done for us as a continent, and to understand that our role as researchers, our role as education researcher is really to understand, like Kenneth said, researching back, understanding the journey that we've had and the implications of this journey and how that relates to the future that we want to create for ourselves. So why are we always talking about decolonization? Why decolonization? And I found this interesting. I just put this one here because it's a very interesting thing to connect with. For some of us that are familiar with the Rhodes Must Fall decolonization movement in South Africa, which started in the University of Cape Town when university students started protesting against the colonial vestiges on their campus, in terms of research, in terms of teaching, in terms of access to education, and so many things happening in the country at the time. And the Rhodes Must Fall movement became a global movement. And you see Rhodes Must Fall moving from South Africa, moving on to places like Oxford, and you see Rhodes Must Fall in Oxford as well. So I asked the question, why decolonization? And the response is just, all roads lead to the colonization of the mind, meaning that as we consistently relate with Western ideology and allow that to dictate the extent of our knowledge, then we're still allowing ourselves to be colonized in our minds. And as we consistently only theorize, only engage research, only approach research in the ways that our colonial masters or former colonial masters are dictated, or what the modern world presume as global best practices, then we are still allowing ourselves to be colonized in our minds. So just wanted to say the resultant effect of this infiltration is, one, the subservient, many African countries are still subservient to the former colonizers. We still have systemic intercontinental racism, you know, within countries, within the continent, and the subtle vestiges of colonialism that are in our countries. So a lot of the challenges that we try to solve in our countries might not exactly be solved if we don't understand how the legacies and vestiges of this colonization is impacting, and especially in the education sector. So many of us want to do projects in out of school children, higher education and all that, but we really need to understand what impact has colonization had on that. Then the subconscious inferiority complex to the structural problems within countries, which is what I've touched base on. And I liked when Kenneth was talking, and he talked about local or theorists or philosophers from within the continent. I of course had two people who are not from within the continent here, but some of these people you can connect with. But these are really a lot of people who have some of the people who have done a lot of work and research in post-colonialism and decolonialism as well. But one particular one I wanted to just mention is one thing I find interesting when I was reading Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind, which is some strategies that we can begin to employ in the decolonization process that we are taking. And the first thing is decolonizing language. Remember when I talked about the trajectory of the maps and how language was a main channel for colonization, and the first step to this is decolonizing language. We need to understand that language can decide the extent of how we go as a nation or as a continent, and even in our work. And another one is decolonizing curriculum. We need to understand that our education system will only be functional when we bring in curriculum that impacts functional and relevant things in terms of communication to students. Pedagogy, how do we teach? And how do we carry out the process of education? How do we research? We need to decolonize research, and that's the bane of what Kenneth has talked about and what we are going to be talking about contributions here. So decolonizing systems, the education system, many of us want to work in education system, but how? So, and more, there's so many ways that we can really get this going. So I just want to finish here, and just hopefully that has sort of created some sort of background into this discussion, and we can begin to engage in this conversation. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to bring Kenneth back on board. So if you have any question or contribution, please raise your hand and I will bring you up right away. So Kenneth, I'm going to add you back to the pin. So Kenneth, I think, okay, so I've got a question asking about the soft copy of the book. Oh, I'm going to see if I have it. I'm not sure, but I'm going to see if I do have it. I will let you have it. I don't know if you have anything to add to your presentation, which was already very solid, from this kind of conversation that we've now begun to have. So Kenneth, I'm going to just let you speak a little bit more on if there's anything that has sort of come up from after your presentation till now that you want to add before we begin to get people's comments. So if you have any question, if anybody has any comment, please let me know. Just raise your hands. If you can't, just probably just type that you have a question, because some people struggle to find the raising hands place anyway. So Kenneth, over to you.
Okay, so what I want to say is that when we think about decolonizing research, we need to always consider ourselves in the research process. I mean, you, the researcher, like when you consider yourself in the research process, what happens is that you are conscious, you are critical of whatever that you are doing. Because when we look at doing research, where we separate ourselves from the work that we do, what happens is that we assume an outsider role, which can be good, but we need to also look at our position in the work and ensure that we raise the voices of the people. We bring out the voices of the people, not our voices. Let me give a clinical example here. So when we look at data analysis in conventional research methods, data analysis from qualitative point of view will tell you, oh, you code the data, you do this and you do that. You know, coding and even this idea of data analysis is very colonial, because you collect data, the data are humans. But what you are saying is that code them, break them down. So you are breaking them down and trying to assemble them again. In breaking them down, they lose their relationships. And even in presenting your research, mostly we bring out the voices of the people only when we want to like use that to add to a point that we are making. In most of the work that we do, we miss most of the people who participate in the work. Their voices are not heard because we partition the data. But how can we look at alternative way of analyzing our data, which in the decolonial frame, I would say making meaning of the stories or making meaning of the data. We can adopt different ways of looking at it, especially when you are conducting a qualitative work and conducted interviews, for instance. Instead of coding and all these things, which you end up partitioning their voices and their stories, you can look at weaving stories together. You can look at alternative ways. And recently, I did a work with some colleagues and we presented it at the UKF IET. It was basically a critical autoethnography of ourselves, 3 people from Ghana doing different work in education. And we brought ourselves into it. So it was more like a question and answer. And we presented it, and all the people were fascinated because they have not seen something like that before. But remember, as Africans, as people, we engage in conversations. So you don't have to always break down your data. Sometimes it is good for you to present your data in a way that represents the voices or even tell more story, weaving the stories. We look at weaving baskets. We look at weaving our textiles in Africa. How can we adopt these methods where our people have always been weaving stories, even in doing what they call thematic analysis, themes and patterns and all. We can always see themes and patterns here. How can we use these ideas to put our data together in a way that's like bring out the voices of the people? And I also say that we need to read more work from Africans. Like you talk of Ngugi Wationgo, he's done excellent work in this field. How can we read the work of these our African people, or not only Africans, but especially the colonized others who are doing this work, and learn from them? There's this book called Indigenous Research Methodologies by Chilisa. This work tries to bring together all the decolonizing ways of doing work, not from Africa alone, but from a more global perspective. People who are doing post-colonial work, like in New Zealand, in Canada, in the US, and in the Caribbean and Latin America, how they understand research methodology. So we need to look at research as a transformation. By looking at it, we can only be able to solve some of our challenges when we understand research from our own ways of everyday engagement. So that is basically what I want to talk about: our methodology, our analysis, how we present data, and also how we recognize the people who are part of our work.
Well, that's absolutely brilliant, and I liked how you summarized everything and touched on some of this very important works, and you really captured that very, very interestingly. One thing I felt I just wanted to add is the fact that as education researchers, it's important that we understand that our work is not isolated, especially even in education generally. We need to get to that point that we know that our work, our research findings are not isolated. So it's easy for someone in education to say, oh, why should I read Ngugi wa Thiong'o is a literature person, or why should I read Chinua Achebe, or why do I need to read Chimamanda Adichie's work, or why should I read Edward Said's, which is almost a bit economic or political economy, if you may. So, it's important for us to understand that in order to really be able to solve some of these major problems, we need to understand the intersectionality that exists, and also to understand the how all of this work can be cross-disciplinary or multidisciplinary? So we've got lots of questions, really, to be honest. I think, Ndi, you've written a lot. I really want to read it, but I wish, if you'd like, we can let you speak for a few minutes, and then if there's any question, then we can take it. Would you like to make any contribution? You can unmute yourself and take it. Otherwise, I'll go on to reading the questions. Okay, so maybe not. So is written, I think we've got like 2 or 3 questions from what is written.
Good afternoon.
Okay, good afternoon.
Okay, I'm very happy with the presentation, and I just want to, first of all, congratulate Mr. Kenneth for the wonderful and brilliant presentation. In the first place, I was so thrilled by when he talked about research done with and by the community. And it gave me much to really chip in about, because in Africa, we seem to be a people of integrity, respect, and we pay much allegiance to where we come from. So, for example, if I'm from Cameroon and I study elsewhere in Nigeria, but I would like to research more about my country, and you want to see that if I am working on peanut flour, like I've just written here, you want to discover that some references or the dietary references I'll have to use come from the US or from Europe. My question was, or a contribution could be, is there a platform where maybe together with the universities and other stakeholders, we could bring in those academicians from all over Africa who are, of course, very, very seasoned. We have a lot of them, like those you are just mentioning, a whole lot of people who have gone through education, and education has passed through them too. Maybe come together through maybe universities, and they set standards too, so that when you are doing research in Africa, you use your own standards, because every time you want to work, you have to use a reference from Europe, a reference from America, and so on and so forth. And it is not really, you don't really feel immersed in it, because you are working in Africa, but the reference you use is not in Africa. Of course, the geographical location and a lot of things have to play a part in the outcome of your research. Your results will obviously be different. So thank you very much, Advantage Africa, and I'm happy to be part of the platform.
Thank you very much, Ndi. So, Kenneth, do you want to say anything, or should I just go ahead? Or I think some of his questions are to us directly, but if you can go ahead and say something.
Okay, so that is a very important observation, and it talks about the ethics of doing research. And we can just look at coloniality of knowledge, where we see valid knowledge emerging from Europe or America, or we look at civilization and modernity happening after Africa encountered Europe. So when they don't want us to refer or reference our own standards or our own ways of engaging communities, what they are trying to say is that your knowledge is not important. And it is some of the things that our higher educational institutions need to look into, because this kind of inferiority complex even happening because of how colonization has caused harm. Like Louise talked about the fact that there is inferiority complex. Yes, because they have made us believe that our knowledges are not up to standard. So as Africans, there's so much work that we need to do, and it starts from the self. We need to decolonize ourselves. We need to decolonize our thinking. We need to even decolonize the way we see knowledge. we need to decolonize the way we see education and the purpose of education, because we cannot always use Europe or America as the standard reference point when we as a people have already developed ourselves in a way that we engage in our own ways of knowing, like ethics, like we have value systems, integrity, but sometimes they don't even trust us. They don't even trust our own traditional protocols. So they are like, yours is not the best. You need to use a reference or a citation from here. Yes, we are not saying don't engage other knowledge systems, but the whole idea of Afrocentricity talks about the fact that Africa should be the cultural center. Whatever that the African learn should be situated within the African context. It is through that we can engage other bodies of knowledge. So if you are not respecting my knowledge, then why do you want me to also engage yours? So we as people researching back is also about questioning the whole idea of methodological imperialism, which is happening. So our institutions really need to decolonize. And there's a lot of critique on African higher educational institutions always becoming puppets to Europe. And our African governments also have a role to play, because funding within higher education institutions in Africa is very minimal. So this funding is coming from research councils in Europe, in America, and they will always impose, because that is the whole idea of coloniality. Colonization is happening, but it is introduced through different forms, and colonialism survives by coloniality, according to Ndlovu Gasheni, who is from Zimbabwe, one of my favorite scholars. You need to engage his work. He talks about colonialism, coloniality, and these issues. So when we understand these issues of cognitive justice, why colonization of the mind is contributing to even Africans not believing in themselves again. And then we will be able to confront this. But I think this is the time for all of us to question.
Okay, so I think I lost Kenneth there. Can you all hear me, or is it Kenneth you can hear? Hello? Can you guys hear me, or because Kenneth looks frozen on my screen?